We are delighted this morning to have Dr. Randall Zachman with us. And he is our theologian in residence for this ensuing forum year. We kind of are following something akin to an academic year. So he will be facilitating or presenting during most of our forum hours over the course of the next several months. And we look forward to having him on board. Many of you already know him or are familiar with him from the Mercy Seminar, and he has visited with us in the past, has graced our pulpit in the past as well. So we have a wonderful relationship with Dr. Zachman. And so I'm going to let him talk a little bit about what we can anticipate in the weeks ahead. And we are just so grateful to have you with us. Thank you so much, Dr. Zachman. Yep. Do you already have your mic on?
I believe so.
Okay.
Is it on? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, thank you, Mother Shana, for that wonderful welcome. And thank you especially for this project. This is a new project for us. Father David and Mother Shana pitched this idea to me over lunch at Iron Hill, which is a wonderful place to pitch ideas. By the way, I highly recommend it. And we have come up with this idea for the forum for the year and also for the theologian in residence. And my wife is absolutely thrilled that I'm a theologian in residence because she's been looking for another residence for me for a while. No, I'm kidding. Just kidding. So this is really exciting though, because this is something I've never done before. I've done like 4-week series, 6-week series, maybe, like the Mercy Seminar runs for 6-week terms. But to do a series going for an entire, what would be like an academic year, basically, there's no real liturgical framework for it, is really a new thing. And this is part of a vision that we've had here at St. James for a while, and that is to try to create programs that aren't just one-off programs that have a sustainability, but they aren't seminary programs either. So there's no midterm and final and grades and credit and all of that, but really to give a more serious educational framework with a very spiritual, contemplative component to it, and with themes that are actually addressing like deep needs in our lives and not just interesting ideas. But I also like interesting ideas, so there's an advantage that way as well. And so what we came up with for this year was the title Knowing the Unknowable God, which I like a lot. We first came up with experiencing God. And I was like, yeah, but some of the people we'll talk about don't really talk about experience. And then I suggested encountering God, which I like. You know, there's this kind of encounter. And Abraham Joshua Heschel would like that. You know, the Jewish view is very encountery. But then there are people who will be studying who don't do that either. They don't talk about encountering God. So then I said, well, what about knowing the unknowable God? And I like dialectical puzzles. So you have knowing and unknowing in the same sentence. And that's the one that went. And it looks like it actually was a good sales marketing strategy. It didn't turn anyone away. And that creates the dynamic actually that we're going to be exploring all of this year. And that is knowing something that's unknowable. What is it like to know something that's unknowable? And how many different ways are there for people to try to enter into a reality that you can come to know, and the more you come to know it, the more you realize it's unknowable. So I really appreciate the brainstorming that we had. The three of us came up with this idea together, which I always think is a better way to go than just one of us doing that, certainly than me. Just to give you a little background about myself, I'm recently in Lancaster. I've learned that you're recently in Lancaster if you don't have 4 generations settled here. so I am absolutely unredeemably a newcomer and will be until I die. My wife and I moved here. She moved here in 2016. She took the job as Executive Director of Finance and Communication at Lancaster Theological Seminary. And I was still teaching in Notre Dame. I taught there for 26 years. And this is my little 25th year pin that she made me wear. And they lost yesterday, so I'm in mourning. But anyway, yes, I know. And so she took the job here, and then I moved out the following May in 2017. So I've been here since May of 2017. And I teach part-time at Lancaster Theological Seminary. I teach a theology course there. Since she was at Lancaster Seminary, she's been called to become the conference minister of the Penn Central Conference of the United Church of Christ, which I told her she needed a longer title. You know? But she's CM of the PCC of the UCC, if that's any help. And she's an ordained pastor in the United Church of Christ, and she's preaching this morning in Southern York. So we're on split agendas this morning. And then we have a son, Johnny, who's a singer-songwriter and also works for a .com company, and he and his wife lived in Austin, Texas. And they're hoping actually to move further east when she's applying for a new job in public health. You'd think there would be tons of jobs in public health, right? And she's getting her master's in public health from not St. John's, Johns Hopkins. Pretty nice. Huh? So anyway, she's very, very bright. Anyway, we're very excited that they might be moving closer. My own work, if you Google me, you'll find that I've done most of my publishing in the theology of Martin Luther and John Calvin, especially John Calvin, and also people like Søren Kierkegaard and Karl Barth and Friedrich Schleiermacher. Oh, this great name. That's my favorite one, Friedrich Schleiermacher, although it's not as good as Nicholas Ludwig Count von Zinzendorf, who is very important for the Moravians, right? So I study historical figures, and I try to figure out what was important to them, and I try to discover things that would surprise me, actually, and that hopefully will surprise other people. So, and my own teaching, that's how I learned how to teach. I didn't start out teaching that way. I didn't start out studying that way, actually. When I started out studying, I had my favorite people, and then I had the people I didn't like. And when I wrote papers and I would cheer on the people I liked and beat up the people I didn't like. Does this sound familiar? It's called American culture, right? And so I was biased and prejudiced and I wasn't going to learn from anyone I didn't like. And I had wonderful teachers who just held my feet to the fire and told me, you're missing really important stuff. A, you're missing the weakness of your own position. And B, you're missing the strength of positions you haven't really fully understood yet. And if you come to understand those positions, you might actually learn how to think in a new and refreshing way. I didn't like these people at all. In fact, it took several rounds. It started at Yale Divinity School. And then when I was at the University of Chicago, I did a course with Langdon Gilkey of blessed memory. It's one of my favorite people I've ever known. And I took a year-long course or two-term course with him on liberal theology. And I did this long paper on Friedrich Schleiermacher, who I didn't like. And I did a beautiful exposition of Schleiermacher's thought, but then at the end of each section, I had a critique of him, which was really cheap. I mean, I'm really embarrassed to have written that. And so Gilkey gave me the paper back. He had to give it back in person. And he said, I want to give it back in person because I almost failed this paper. And I said, oh, of course the blood drains from my head. And he said, and here's why. He said, in terms of, here are the grades I gave you. Exposition of Schleiermacher's thought, A. Ability to see the strength of Schleiermacher's position when you don't agree with it, C-. Ability to see how Schleiermacher's position is actually better than your own in certain points, C-. And he basically said, I'm giving you an A, but don't you ever do this again. Okay. And I tried. God might be my witness that I haven't done very well, but that was really a turning point in my education was in doing that. And with the generosity that he had, because I could tell he was really upset. The generosity he had was really quite something. So the way I came to teach was based on the way my teachers taught me. And as I taught people that I thought I didn't like, I actually came to see, holy cow, they're really interesting. And they've actually shaped the way I see things very fundamentally in ways that are quite surprising. So that's the way I learned how to study theology myself. And that's the way I've learned to teach theology. It can be very frustrating because sometimes people think, you're acting like you're Rene Descartes, right? So when I'm talking to you, you're like representing this position so much. Where's Zachman in all of this? So I try not to do that as much as I used to, but it was so interesting to me what happens when you try to see the world the way somebody else saw it. And we're lucky that these people left these writings, right? So there's so many millions and millions of people who will never get to know that way. But the opportunity to see the world the way somebody else saw it, based on what they left in their writings, is really quite an honor. It's one of the great gifts of writing culture, I think. So what we'll be doing this year Is there anyone else waiting? I hate to leave people in the waiting room forever. This is a new thing for me. I feel like I'm, on the Starship Enterprise, trying to fly this thing and talk at the same time. So I hope everything's going well. But so what I thought we would do this year, and we'll see how it goes. I have scheduled one figure a week. If it turns out that's too fast a pace, we have lots of time, so we can actually slow it down a little bit. But I think we can actually do this. So what I thought we'd do is investigate the way this knowing the unknowable God theme has been explored from the earliest days of the Christian tradition to now. And so God willing, and if Shana and David agree, I'll be here after Christmas in the new year, and we'll start a whole new round of people. But that's the plan starting next week. So. And I've put together already for Irenaeus of Lyon, I'll talk about him in a minute, a selection of sort of paragraphs from his writing that get at this issue, and then some other issues as well. So there'll actually be something for you to look at as I'm yakking up here. I always find that to be helpful too, that you're not then just taking my word for it. You can say, well, actually, it says here's something very different than what you just said. So in any case, is there somebody in the waiting room? No. Okay. But I'll talk in a little bit about that. I did want to explore a little more though about where this theme of knowing the unknowable God comes from, and it's actually very old in the biblical witness. It starts actually with scenes in the Hebrew Bible in the book of Exodus in particular, when Moses asks to see God. And it's this beautiful scene on Mount Sinai. God is finally getting around to possibly forgiving the Israelites for the golden calf. He's already pardoned them and has decided not to annihilate them through Moses' intercession, but he hasn't promised yet to go with them again. And so Moses is working very hard to get God to go with him. And he realizes that God views him with favor, right? He doesn't view anyone else in Israel with favor, but he views Moses with favor. And so he says, if I have found favor in your sight, oh, thank you so much. I do have an ad for Starbucks, but this is actually probably better for my speaking voice. So anyway, thank you very much. If I have found favor in your sight, let me see your, show me your face, right? And God tells him, no one can see my face and live. So he shows him his back. And it's very enigmatic, isn't he? He hides him in the cleft of a rock, and he passes before him and holds his hand before him, and then Moses can see the back of God. And so that's a metaphor for many people of knowing something that's unknowable. What's even more intriguing is God is said to dwell in thick darkness. I mean, in the Hebrew Bible, God dwells in thick darkness. I think that's really interesting. I kind of like that. Because I don't know about you, I've always been, ever since I was young, I've been obsessed with death. That tells you something about me as well, right? I'm not a big fan of death, so I'm hoping death stays away as long as possible. But so the future for me, and even the presence of God for me, has always been darkness. It's been like almost a void in which there's a presence. And so when I came across this idea in the Bible that God dwells in thick darkness, I'm like, okay, I can get behind that. But in the New Testament, and I have the quotes in the opening paragraph, God is said to dwell in unapproachable light, which is a very different motif, right? So in the Hebrew Bible, it's thick darkness, like when God enters the temple to sanctify it after Solomon dedicates it, it's thick darkness that comes into the temple. In the New Testament, though, it's unapproachable light, but notice it's unapproachable either way. So what are you seeing in thick darkness? Really nothing, but there's a presence, but the presence of God is there, right? So again, you're encountering something, you're knowing something, like God is there. Solomon says, oh, you're there, but what is there, right? And then the same thing with unapproachable light. The light is so bright, this light is so overwhelming, you can't even get near it. And yet that's where God dwells, right? So those two metaphors are visual metaphors, but I think they're very helpful actually, really get at the same idea that there is God in this darkness, and yet you can't see God. And there is God in this light, but you can't even approach the light. You want to approach the light, but you can't. It's also interesting though, because in the book of Exodus, right before this encounter on Mount Sinai, God is described as meeting with Moses in the tent of meeting, and Moses sees him face to face and talks to him like a friend, right? In fact, he's so intimate with God that when he comes out of the tent of meeting, his face glows. And the Israelites are so freaked out by this that they ask him to put a veil over his face. Even the reflection of God's glory from Moses' face is too much for them, right? So which is it? Can God be seen face to face by Moses and have this intimate conversation with him? Or is God never seen face to face? Right? So again, you can see there's an ambivalence and ambiguity, a tension, a dialectical tension, as I would call it, in the Bible itself, about whether God can be known, and if so, how much. And there's always the sense, though, that God really can't be known, that God is an unknowable reality that you come to know. So this is, in other words, this isn't just something that theologians dreamt up, which we do, right? We're like, that's an interesting idea. I just read a poem by so-and-so, and I think I'll do that. But so it isn't just an idea somebody dreamt up. It's actually embedded in the biblical witness to the self-revelation of God, is that you come to know God, and God is unknowable. I have a very dear friend of mine, Noam Zion, who's a modern Orthodox scholar. And I was talking to him about this class. I'm really excited about this class. It's about the self-revelation of the unknowable God. He goes, we don't talk about self-revelation of God. I said, really? He said, no, don't talk about that. It's God reveals the Torah. God doesn't reveal God's self. God is completely unknowable. And all we can know of God is the Torah, both the written Torah and the oral Torah. And that's what we should focus on. Because I don't know what you Christians are talking about. So this is a distinctive, I mean, it really is true. This is a very distinctively Christian thing, that we're really interested in God, the self-revelation of God, and not so much, and this is quite damning, I think, for us, not so much in the will of God. So in his mind, it's like, wouldn't the Sermon on the Mount be enough to keep you really busy for the rest of your life if you went about trying to do that? But no, we want to talk about how can you know something that's unknowable. So this is, I thought that was really interesting, because I wanted to talk to him about this dialectic in Jewish thought, and he's like, no, we don't talk about that. So, which is true. Like Maimonides, who's the great Jewish teacher in the Middle Ages, who's still revered by the Orthodox of all kinds. That was his point, is God is so transcendent, don't even bother, just look at the Torah, right? So anyway, so it seems to be a distinctively Christian way of reading the Bible, which I think is important to keep in mind. On the other hand, Jewish theologians have been reading Christian theology, and they've actually come to appreciate a lot of the things that we'll be talking about this term. I have a very good friend named Jerome Gellman, who lives in Jerusalem, and he is an Orthodox Jewish scholar as well. And he exhorted his colleagues to read what's called apophatic theology. And apophatic theology we'll be reading this fall. Pseudodionysius is the apophatic theologian. So apophatic simply means you can't know, the unknowability of God. So there are certain theologians who really stress the unknowability of God. And here's this very wonderful Jewish friend of mine who's like, yeah, that's something we all need to learn from. So there's some interesting interfacing going on between our traditions now, which I think is really encouraging. Okay, so that's the idea behind the forum, and it's a rather, I mean, it's a pretty interesting idea to do. I'm really, as I said, I'm really tickled. They're encouraging me to go ahead and do this. So we will start next week then with the first figure we'll look at. And as I said, we'll see how that goes. If it looks like that's too fast a pace and we want to linger a little more with somebody, we can do that too. But I actually kind of like the idea of keeping the train going though, because then if you stop, then you could spend the whole time on that person. And that is true. Any of the people we're looking at here, we could spend the whole time on them. So this will be more of a tour, right? You'll be on a double-decker bus. If you've ever gone on a double-decker bus, they're really cool. I went on one in Chicago. I knew Chicago really well until I went on a double-decker bus ride. And it was open on the top, and I'm riding around looking at Chicago like this. I was like, I've never seen Chicago like that. So anyway, so hopefully it'll be like that. This will be a double-decker tour, but you'll be saying, that building looks really interesting, but we're moving on now. And then maybe you'll go back and live in one of those buildings for a while, if you get to know that person. So we'll start out, I'm just working chronologically with the people that I think would be the most interesting to examine. So next week, we will look at Irenaeus of Lyon, who is a very interesting theologian from the second, like right around 200 of the Common Era was when he was working. And then shortly after him, Origen of Alexandria. These are two of the most important foundational kind of theologians in the Christian tradition. Irenaeus is the consummate biblical theologian, and I'll talk more in a minute about what that might mean for him. And Origen is the consummate contemplative theologian. He is absolutely crucial for the development of the Christian mystical tradition and also of Christian monasticism. So these figures have a lot of spirituality in them, not just ideas, which is really interesting. So we'll look at those two to sort of start out. And then Athanasius of Alexandria is next. And he was involved in the debates, especially the debates about the Trinity. We won't be talking about that per se, but just to let you know. And he also wrote a very influential book, which we'll look at in Advent, called The Life of Anthony. And Anthony is one of the great desert fathers in the early church period. So, and then Gregory of Nyssa is one of my favorite people. We'll look especially at his book, The Life of Moses, and his sister Macrina. My wife kept saying, you have too many men, right? And I said, but the problem in the early church is they were dominated by bishops, right? And the bishops were men. So if there were women thinkers and teachers, they didn't leave anything in writing because it would have been very controversial. But Gregory of Nyssa was had his sister Macrina, he called his greatest teacher. And so he even wrote a life of Macrina, which is an incredible honor that he did. She wouldn't write, she didn't believe in that, but so we'll talk about her influence on him as well. And Gregory of Nyssa, in the Life of Moses, he points out that as Moses goes up, he goes from a theophany of light, which is the burning bush, to a theophany of darkness, which is on top of Sinai. There's this thick darkness. And so for him, knowing God is this constant progression from light to dark, to light to dark, to light to dark that never ends. It's eternal. So he's very interesting. And then Augustine of Hippo, who is the most important Latin theologian. We'll look especially at his understanding of the relationship between being healed and being able to see. So he comes to see God, but then God drives him away. Isn't that interesting? It's like you think God would say, oh, you finally saw me. Okay, here, welcome. He's like, no, go away. Right? So he's driven away into what he calls a region of unlikeness. And that's actually quoted by Dante at the beginning of the Inferno, that he finds himself in a dark wood in this kind of region of unlikeness. And so how then, Augustine's whole quest is, how can I approach again the God who's driving me away? And why is God driving me away? So there's a very interesting, that's another interesting thing. You see God, and then you long for that, and then you're driven away. And then how does that work? And then finally, at the end of this sort of module, if you will, we'll look at Pseudodionysius. He was actually, when Paul is in the Agora in Athens, he preaches the sermon on the resurrection, and a fellow there named Dionysius, who's in the Areopagite, that's just the market, believes him, right? And so you have this figure who allegedly heard the Apostle Paul and became a believer. Well, this figure Dionysius was discovered much later on to be pseudo, right? It was a pen name that this person adopted and wasn't the person who heard Paul preach in the Areopagus. But on the other hand, people like Thomas Aquinas, way late, we're talking, the 13th, 14th century, thought that this was in fact a near apostolic figure. And so he cites him as an authority as much as he cites Augustine of Hippo. So when I say Pseudo-Dionysius, it sounds like, we shouldn't really take him seriously. He's absolutely one of the most influential theologians in the Christian tradition. But it turns out he wrote much later, around 600 of the Common Era. Yeah. But and not all of his writings survive, but he wrote one book, which is fascinating. The title is Mystical Theology, and he coins the term mystical, right? So we talk about mysticism and the mystical and all of that. The word mystery was clearly known. Obviously, that starts with like the book of Daniel, God reveals mysteries. But mystical theology is Pseudodionysius. So we'll look at that work in particular, and also a book on divine names. He's really, really interesting and very hard to understand. So he's drawn people. There's an Anglican theologian named Sarah Coakley working today, very influential English theologian and in the Anglican tradition, who is very influenced by Pseudodionysius and thinks that apophatic theology has a lot to offer to us in our own day. So we'll probably get to her if we, in May. So I'm just looking at. So that's the first chunk of authors that we'll look at. It's kind of a heady brew, but what we'll do though is we won't be talking about everything they say. We'll be looking at this dynamic as it works itself out in their thoughts. So hopefully it won't feel like it's just completely overwhelming. And I find these people really interesting, so I'll try to also pull in the sails a little bit myself as we talk about them.
And I'm being mindful of the time. Will you have a few moments for people to ask questions?
Yeah, absolutely. I was just gonna mention Advent so we can get out of here, but like one more minute. Is that okay? Just to point ahead. I thought it would be really interesting for Advent to include people I was going to include anyway, but kind of put them in their own little category, because Advent to me is always John the Baptist in the wilderness of the River Jordan. And there were people, the wilderness is really interesting. I just wrote this article, a short little reflection for Notre Dame Faith, and it goes out to all these people. And it was on when Jesus says this generation, this adulterous and evil generation. So I was like, what's wrong with that generation? So when you look at the Bible, the first generation that's a real problem is the generation that saw everything that God did in Egypt and just constantly rebelled, right? You'd think they were eyewitnesses to what God did in Egypt. They would be the believers par excellence, but instead they're constantly, why did you bring us out in the wilderness? To kill us? Why did you bring us out in the wilderness? To make us starve and all this stuff? And so finally they get to the land of Canaan and they reject it. It's a land that devours its people. And so they want to kill Aaron and Moses. They say no to Yahweh, they elect captains to lead them back, and they turn around and decide to go back to Egypt. And God says that generation will not enter the land and they'll die in the wilderness. But the generation that didn't live in Egypt, but that grew up in the wilderness was the most holy generation, one of the most holy generations in Israel. And this stuck. Right? So throughout Israelite tradition, right through the Christian tradition, there is a sense that the wilderness, if you want to encounter God, if you want to know the unknowable God, leave the city, put your darn phones down, turn off the television, really go to the wilderness, right? Because the problem with the generation from Egypt was, when we were in Egypt, we had really good food, right? So we had lots of diversions and stuff. And out here, there's nothing but this manna and the stupid water coming out of rocks and all that. So there's something about deprivation that enhances your awareness of everything, right? Your awareness of yourself, all the little demons in us that we stuff down with all sorts of techniques we perfected. We all do this, right? Well, except at 4 a.m, then they're like, surprise, at least for me, just speaking for me. That's when they all jump me, right? And I'm like, ah. So anyway, there were a series of women and men in this early period who realized that if they really were going to take discipleship seriously, they had to leave the city and go into the wilderness. And so they mirror that generation in the wilderness, and they're conscious of that. They're mirroring the generation that went to the wilderness before it could inherit Canaan, right? So if you're going to inherit the kingdom of God, go to the wilderness. Where did Jesus go before he proclaimed the kingdom of God? The wilderness. He was baptized there, and then what? The Spirit leads him deeper into the wilderness. And he fasts for 40 days and 40 nights, right? So Jesus himself is mirroring this. So these people are like, this is the way to go. If you want to prepare for the kingdom of God, if you want to know the unknowable God, go into the wilderness. And so they do, they go and they live in these caves for the whole rest of their lives. And of course, they go out there to be alone and people flock out to see them, right? So and if you know Conrad Beisel up in the Ephrata cloisters, Conrad Beisel is this really eccentric German radical reformer type. And he left Germany to come over here. And then there were too many people in Philly for him. I think it was Philly. And so he's like, I'm going to go out into the wilderness, which at that point was Ephrata, and there's no one there, right? And he goes and builds his little retreat place, and all these people come out to be with him. So he builds this whole cloister and everything, but it was the last thing he wanted to do. So this is what happens with the Desert Fathers and Mothers, is people go out to see them, and that's the beginning of monasticism. Right, so then you organize communities of people who are withdrawn from the world. And so we'll end with John Cashin, who goes out and studies with the mothers and fathers, and then Benedict of Nursia, who organizes Benedictine monasticism. So I thought that would be really a cool way of exploring, and we'll be looking at them on the same theme of knowing the unknowable God, but they'd all tell us the way we're all living. I mean, I just pick myself. They look at my life and go, you don't know anything. You have not abandoned anything. You think you can know God by clinging to all these things? You know, you're talking about upgrading your Verizon phone and upgrading your Honda CRV, and it's like, no, that's not. You got to go the other way. You got to turn around and go the other way. So they'll be very challenging to all of us. And actually, everyone we'll read would have been living that way, right? They wouldn't have been living in the wilderness, but they'd all be leading these deeply ascetic lives. And so they would say one of the ways to come to know God is to change the way you're living, like radically. So anyway, all right, I'll stop now. I lied, it was more than a minute.
You did. I'm like,
That won't be
3 minutes.
that won't be the first time, but anyway, or the last time.
No, but we did have, we had a late start, so I appreciate you cramming so much in a short amount of time. And in the Sundays ahead, we'll get to explore this a lot more. Why isn't this
I don't know,
coming
right,
on? Yeah, sometimes it takes a moment. Okay. Can you all hear me still on Zoom? Yeah, okay, great.
Okay,
Because
good. Yeah,
I'm
that
close
makes
to the
really
mic,
good, right?
yeah.
That makes really good.
So we have a couple of minutes if anyone has any questions. I, for one, am excited about this topic in knowing the unknowable God, especially during such a time when people doubt there is a God at all. Oftentimes, in times of crisis, what we call theodicy, is there a good and kind and loving God when bad things happen? Or some people find God or spirituality insignificant. So I feel like with these saints in particular, they all experience some form of crisis of faith at some point in time, which is why I think their lives are so fascinating. I mean, even Mother Teresa, toward the end, she was just having a dark night of the soul. And I think it's okay. And that's what brings us closer and in wanting to understand more about our neighbor and our encounters with God and knowing the unknowable God, if that's even possible.
Mhm.
So any questions at all before we